My name's Keryn Davis and I'm a senior researcher at Core Education, and I'm thrilled to pieces to be on the sofa today with some wonderful minds in education. So thank you all so much for coming. The session will be an interactive one. There'll be an opportunity for you to have to ask questions and join in the discussion. So we've got this really fun mic. Has anybody been to one of these sofa sessions before and had this mic chucked their way? So later on, when you get a chance to ask some questions, we'll be throwing the mic around so you can ask your questions. And in the top, the instructions are there, just speak into the top of it. So that's, don't lose it. So I'm thrilled to have Larry Rosenstock on this end of the couch to my right, Maria Tibble beside me, which is wonderful, Rose Hipkins, who many of you will know already, and Joyce Seitzinger. So thank you so much to our panellists for coming along today. I'm going to begin by allowing them an opportunity to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their work and what brings them to this sofa, where the focus is on transforming learning and assessment. The abstract is up on the screens beside or around us, but I've given them permission to speak about the things that they're really passionate about. They might want to disrupt some of the ideas up there on the screen. They might want to challenge them. They may want to take it into a completely different direction. I'm going to allow them the opportunity to do that. And I wait with interest to hear what they've got to say, as I'm sure you are too. So I'm going to begin by allowing, we'll start down your end, Joyce, is that right? To introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about their work, and then we'll begin to talk and discuss the focus of the session. So thank you.
Okay. Keryn, do you want me to elaborate on my part of the abstract now, or just do an introduction?
No, just do an intro and then we'll come back to that, if that's okay.
Hi everyone, kia ora. My name is Joyce Seitzinger. I'm a learning designer. I've been a learning designer for about 17 years. I've worked in the Netherlands. I'm originally from the Netherlands. I've worked in the Netherlands in corporate training. I then moved to New Zealand, where I worked for 5 years at EIT Hawke's Bay as an e-learning advisor, and I'm currently based in Melbourne, where I run my own company called Academic Tribe, and we are like a distributed network of learning designers, and we've been doing a lot of work in the tertiary sector mainly. Over the last 2 years, I've been specializing in seeing how we can use user experience design and service design thinking approaches in the learning design work that we do. So that's kind of the angle that I'll be taking. I've also been working with open badges, so I might drop some of that into this session today. So really pleased to be here and looking forward to the session.
Kia ora koutou. I'm Rosemary Hipkins. I'm one of 3 chief researchers at the New Zealand Council for Educational Research, where I've been working for quite some years, but before that I was a secondary school teacher. There's probably people in the room who know that my subject areas were science and biology, and that they're still areas of great interest for me. But in my work for NZCER, I keep an oversight of our curriculum and assessment work, and I quite often feel sort of pulled in 2 directions, because it's my absolute determination to keep curriculum and assessment talking meaningfully to each other, and I'm sure you know that's not always easy. I'll have plenty more to say about that.
Ai tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi mahana ki a koutou, ko tai mai wainganui te iwi o Ngāti Whakaue. Ko nonga taha te maunga, ko rotorua nui a kahumata momo e te moana, ko Utahina te awa, ko Pukeroa te maunga, ko Ngāti Pukaki te hapu, ko te whanua te tūpuna, ko Maria Hau. Kia ora koutou. Just basically told you, welcome to my part of the land. I was born and bred here. My tūpuna, my DNA is in the land that you are standing on when you move. Very proud. I'm culturally located in my own whenua, and I guess I'm sitting here thinking, why am I here? But basically, my work, I began in primary school, taught there for about 7 years, and the first challenge for me there was Rotorua, Round Lake. I was brought up on this side. I was put over on the other side, where 17% Māori were in the school, and that was totally foreign to me. And so, but it allowed me to face my own prejudices and learn, disrupted my thinking, I suppose is what Derek would say. From there I moved to intermediate because I had a passion for our te reo, and I wanted to be a part of making a difference in the lives of my people. And so I went away and learnt about second language acquisition, and because the state of our reo is in crisis at the moment. And then I moved from there. I decided I would follow my students because I was at intermediate, year 7 and 8. Then I decided I would follow my students to high school to see what happened over there. And I became an RTLB over there, and what I found, I guess, was each school have their own character and their own passions, and they're very much the same. They just need to talk. And then I moved to core education, and my current position is as working in Māori medium with kura, dual medium schools, to design the curriculum based on the aspirations of whānau, hapu and iwi and the students. Kia ora tātou.
My name is Larry Rosenstock, and since I did a keynote, I don't want to put you through all that again, but I have taught carpentry to inner city kids. I taught filmmaking to inner city kids. I taught at a law school at Harvard. I taught at 2 graduate schools of education, Harvard and Cal Berkeley. And I've made 2 MOOCs, massively open online courses that are on Coursera. One is How to Start a School, and another one is called How to Teach Us by Kids, actually, which has 9,700 people playing on it right now. So I've been having a great career and the gift of, like you, working with young people. The third of my 3 children, the youngest, just started teaching kindergarten in Harlem, and as I was just sitting here, she texted me a question, and I actually had an answer for her. So finally got a teacher. Yes! So it's great to be here.
Well, is it on? Is it on? Yep. Oh, it is. Doesn't sound like it. Thank you so much. Well, I'm now going to invite our panellists to respond in some way to the focus of our discussion today and respond in some way to the abstract. I'm just going to see if Rose, who's sitting beside me, would take up that offer for a start. Thank you.
Oh, totally. A lot of people in the room will know that I've done quite a lot of work in the area of looking at how the key competencies are implemented in our school curriculum in New Zealand, and I have been implacably opposed to rushing to assess them by building rubrics around the individual key competencies. I've been quite consistent in that position from the start, but actually I'd quite like to take this opportunity to tell you about a little bit of breakthrough thinking that we've been doing. I find it quite interesting that it's taken 10 years of actively researching, thinking about and talking in this area to get to this position, which I imagine will be something that's new for pretty much everybody in the room. Obviously I can't lay it out in detail, but I'm thinking about 2 things from this morning's keynote, and I want to just start with a couple of sticky thoughts and a caution. So the sticky thoughts, the first one is, just because we could assess it, should we? That's my first one. I want you to hold that because I think that's a really important question to ask. Because when I look at the abstract, I think that one of the things that we do, that we're tempted to do, is to say, well, what we assess is what we value. We know that we value this, therefore how can we assess it? And we just keep ourselves in that go round. So that's my first one. Just because we could, should we? And my second one, and this speaks more to the heart of what I'm just going to explain to you, is are there some bellwether things which, if we assess those, will by implication be bringing a lot of other things along with them? Because, you know, if we add these, if I think about Michael's 6 C's this morning, and we've got 5 key competencies in our curriculum, and then the other things coming in over the top that people are talking about, like global citizenship and all those sorts of things. And you think about the detail that's in the progressions that primary school teachers, well, up to year 10, isn't it, work with just in reading, writing and maths. Now, they're fantastic, those progressions, but how detailed they are. Now, you start adding a whole lot of other stuff to be really meaningful and validly and reliably assessed, specified at that level of detail. That's a recipe for a nervous breakdown for teachers, isn't it? You cannot carry that amount of stuff in your head. So my mission is to make sure that what we're going to focus on are the things that we really should focus on, and a very few of them at that. So that's, having laid out that background, let me tell you just very briefly what we've been doing about this, because I was asked to do a retrospective analysis of how kids have shown evidence across the first round of national monitoring, which is the replacement program for NEM, and therefore covers all the levels of the curriculum with a light sampling in our schools, to say what evidence is there that kids are making progress in their key competencies. Now, that's a how long is a piece of string question, but we've come to this strategy, and it's based on this idea. If you look at the definition of key competencies in the curriculum, they are defined as capabilities for living and lifelong learning. It's in the box just underneath the title. And the realisation and the rich exemplification that we've had over the years as we've worked with them, that if you get a task that's really rich, all of the key competencies, aspects of all of them or most of them, will be needed to be drawn on to do that task. So as part of this challenge for NMSSA, the National Monitoring Program, what we did was to look at a whole range of rich tasks across the areas that had been assessed, specifically looking for ones that had a demand for at least several of the key competencies. So we could say, for the kids to be able to do this, they're going to need to draw on this and this and this. Then we line them up, all these tasks, we looked at them and we said, are there some things that we can see that are appearing in all of them? And there were. So that's where our focus is at the moment, and looking at making some plan for manageably looking at these things instead of looking at hundreds of different things and bewildering people with a range of tools and things. The things that cropped up over and again, capabilities that we think it's really important to help students build and that are teachable and learnable, and that's really important, are perspective taking, that's one, critical inquiry, and disciplinary meaning making, which is what I'm doing my workshop on after the afternoon tea break. Those won't particularly surprise you, I don't imagine, especially when they're unpacked, but that's the piece of work that I'm doing at the moment, and if you want to talk to me more about that, I'll be really happy to do that.
Thanks, Rose. I think we'll certainly come back to your ideas, and I'm particularly interested in hearing about some of those rich tasks and the features of those and the environments that you've been working in. Joyce, can I hand over to you now?
So when I think about assessment, I think about it very much in a practical kind of approach, and the work that we do as learning designers, where we quite often work alongside subject matter experts in order to design a learning experience for the students that we're trying to serve. And I think one of the most difficult things that I've really encountered, and that I encounter in almost every single project that we take on, is that we're very strong about wanting to include constructive alignments, making sure that the assessment actually works across the entire learning experience, and yet it's quite often the bureaucratic processes in the organizations that we work with that really hold us up. So while we try to as part of the learning experience, we design really innovative and transformational learning activities that we can do. Quite often then there's a jolt when it comes to the assessment, because we're actually not able to change the assessment that quickly. And that is something that I often think probably jolts the learner out of a kind of a coherent, congruous learning experience as well. And those almost become like quite frightening and intimidating way markers on their learning pathway. And with this, I think one of the most exciting things that I've seen happening in terms of how people see their own achievements in their learning journey is the open badges that I was talking about earlier. For those of you who aren't familiar with Mozilla's open badges, I think most people are, but just a quick recap, it was a project that was taken on by Mozilla starting in 2011 to design a way of recognizing people's learning and achievement through what they call an open badge infrastructure. Basically, just setting up a standard which people can use in order to actually issue badges. And the badges are basically just an image file, but they have metadata baked into them. And so you can actually include things like the criteria, what did a learner have to do in order to achieve that badge, things like who is the issuing authority, that's usually your educational organization, and also a link to possible evidence that learner has actually achieved that work and done that work. And I think that's been really interesting way, because it actually gives people, the learners, a different way of actually looking at their own learning pathway. They can kind of see where they've been before. You can get a real emotional connection to a digital artifact like that as well. You can see where you've been, and then they can also act as perhaps more friendly way markers to think about the different directions that your learning journey is going to have going forward. If you haven't been doing any of the badge work, I know that Tara's Connected Educators are issuing badges in the work that they do, and also I noticed in the program that you can actually earn some digital badges for just attending the conference as well. And so I think one of the things that we're seeing with the badges is they're not getting as much traction as we'd hoped. I think they really work when you start to look at them at an ecosystem level, so maybe at a, like for instance in Australia, at a state or maybe even at a national level. I think it's very difficult for individual institutions to adopt them because they don't transfer quite well across to other people's academic standards. And for that reason, I think that some of the work that you might be interested in is the work that John Mott has been doing in the United States, where rather than kind of trying to implement a whole new system with like open badges, he's actually been trying to build a badge concept on top of something that's already an accepted part of how we do education, which is the transcript. And they've been doing a lot of interesting work with this idea of the extended transcript, where learners can actually see themselves progressing along various skill levels and then earn badges alongside. And again, those extended transcripts are aimed to actually go across your entire learning journey as you go from one institution to the next. So I think there's some really interesting work being done there, but again, some of it probably needs to be done at a higher level than just the individual institutional level.
Thanks, Joyce. I mean, there's certainly elements of student agency represented in those ideas and how to engage students in understanding and making sense of their personal learning journeys, I guess, is being described there. So I know that that's something we'll be picking up on later as we progress, and that's going to take me now to hand the mic to Maria to provide a perspective on this work and from her view. So, Maddie, do you want this one?
I just have 3 questions. The first one is, put your hand up if you have Māori students in the setting that you work in. Great. Put your hand up if you can name the iwi that some of those children affiliate to. Cool. And that's my third question. Can't see it. Cool. I guess I wanted to ask that because that's the place that I belong in, that area I belong in. And so there are 3, I guess I see them as 3 curriculum that operate. There's New Zealand curriculum, Te Marautanga o Aotearoa, which the Minister talked about briefly in her presentation. And the third one is Te Aho Matua. So are there any teachers, principals, leaders in here who work with Te Marautanga o Aotearoa? Kia ora. Okay. Right, that sort of gets me to thinking. One of the major differences for Te Marautanga o Aotearoa with the NZC at the very beginning was we don't ask about the what are we teaching, what is the content, what is. The single most important thing is who. Who is the person that we have in front of us that we are going to nourish and grow? And when you position yourself like that, you are thinking about, as people say, the student is at the heart of the learning and, ko te pūtake o te, ko te tamaiti. But I guess one of the ways that we may work differently is that we go and we ask the whānau, the families of the students who are in the Rumaki classes where we work, might be bilingual. And I guess I'm talking about this because I can see that there's a transference that can happen. Because some of the work that we have done with the Māori medium environments, the principals who have been non-Māori have taken that model and put it right across the school. So the first difference was who, we talk about the who. Second thing is that we go back to the students, we go back to the families, we go back to the hapu, the sub-tribes, and we go back to the iwi, if the dynamics allow it, and we ask, what is it that you want? What are the aspirations that you have for your child while they are here? If they're at intermediate, or from primary, 6 years. For those who are tracking a te reo development, it's not 6 years. They start from early childhood and go right through. It has to be a deliberate te reo plan. But I guess the aspirational voice that we collect has a huge impact on the design of the curriculum that follows. And because the whānau, you've engaged them in ways to really look at what is important to them, what are the non-negotiables that we cannot go past for the design that we have for the students. And we do this, and I guess I really wanted to make it clear, that I'm Ngāti Whakaue, because I use that as an example. One of the, generically you get things like, we want our kids to know the history. We want our kids to know their genealogy here. We want the kids to know, we want them to be 21st century learners. We want them to know their, the reo that comes from this particular area. So all of those, we start to unpack those with the whānau. What comes out of it are things like who the DNA of the people are. So I hear, entrepreneurs, innovation, transformation, all these words thrown around. But nobody, when I was going through school, told me that some of my ancestors, they never quoted them in those words as innovators. So one of our hugest innovators from around here, or our explorers, was a person called Ihinga. Another one was Tamata Kapua in Ngā Toroirangi, who was able to navigate through the stars and bring our canoe all the way over to Aotearoa. And why I say that is because when we start quoting start talking about the stories that the Māori students in your school, you know, they have a genealogy that comes from those stories. Their DNA are in those stories. So how do you put those into your design of your curriculum? How do you celebrate who they are? Because when they know who they are, you can actually start to look at and use that model for them to look at other people. So when we talk about the rangatiratanga and leadership, I can talk about tamata kapua, I can talk about ngā toroirangi, but I can also look at the stories that emulate the characteristics that I want my kids to be able to identify, so that when they can identify them in our Māori world, they can identify them globally. And I guess I'm talking about all of that because once we've got, I've got here, do a cultural landscape audit, and we look at questions like, who are the leaders, who are the change agents, who are the revolutionaries, past and present, that have led, guided or modelled the hapu or iwi. And I ask you, can you name those for the areas that you live in? The students who come to your school. And I'm not challenging you, I'm just provoking thinking. Can you identify the key geographical features that tell the stories of the people? So you come here, and what's one of the first geographical resources you notice? We call them ngafa. Other people call them geysers and hot water pools. But those are very significant. We have some ancestors buried in some of those. I just heard a kōrero the other day about NASA scientists coming over here, and they're coming back to take a group of students because they're doing a project, Māori students, they're doing a project called Mission to Mars, and they're looking at the extremities because it's an extreme environment. It's the same as possibly the environment on Mars, but to have them come and, they culturally locate themselves with the stories here, and then they're also bringing their knowledge to us. So I'll leave it there, but it all leads to the discussions that we have around what is the non-negotiable content, and then out of that we form a graduate profile, not by the teachers, by the whānau and the students themselves, and then everything from there is focused on that profile, and the content comes out of the tool that we use, and then the assessments come from that. So it's co-constructed, it's, I don't know, but anyway, kia ora.
Thank you. There's kind of a cautionary tale that happened in the United States in the late 1980s where 5 professors each wrote a separate book, and then they did a book together called The Nation at Risk. And what the 5 had written about were stories about all the different K-12 schools that they had studied throughout the United States, and the risk was that there was no variation or insufficient variation between them. And perhaps a recognition that the world is changing a lot faster than schools are, and that there ought to be differentiation between them. And then there are 50 states and 49 governors, actually led by Bill Clinton when he was not yet a president, and this is how he became president. They met at the University of Virginia for a day and a half to discuss a nation at risk. And of course, they didn't talk about education for more than about an hour and a half, and they kicked it over to a conversation in New York that happened a year later. I was one of the people at that meeting, in which there was a debate between whether they should be called standards or expectations. Some people thought they should be called standards. The rest of us felt that they should be called expectations, because if you add a few letters to standards, you get standardization, and standardization is the death knell of innovation. So that's how the United States got standards. And now we have content standards, and now, as here, we're talking about how to measure content standards. Measuring things, of course, has its risks. Howard Gardner started something called Project Zero at Harvard. It's still there. He started 30 years ago. And when he started it, he called it Project Zero because he asked the question, how much do we really know about assessment? And it's still called Project Zero. I don't know if anybody was in the workshop that I did a couple hours ago, but there was one that I did that came from Project Zero. So I'll describe it for a minute or two, and I want to tell you what the result was of the exercise that we did with about 30 or 40 teachers from New Zealand. I've been doing it for about 25 years. It always works out every single time. I've done it in several countries. The protocol is to ask the teachers at tables to describe the most significant learning experiences that they had in their own career or life as a student, or life outside of school. And then those 4 or 5 people share what all the experiences were, and then they spend some time and come up with the characteristics of those experiences that made them the most significant learning experiences in their life. Asking somebody what is the most powerful learning experience in your life is, of course, an act of assessment. And then we didn't have a Wordle, but we did write up on a board all of the elements that everybody said at that session about how they learned best. It was relevant, there was play, it was outside of the curriculum, it was practical, there were different strategies, it was challenging, there was perseverance, there was risk, there were relationships, there was community, it was hands-on, it was meaningful, there was ownership, it was collaborative, there was trust, there was joy, there was a real audience, it was emotional, there were mistakes, it was creative, there was freedom, and there was choice. So the real sense of this exercise to me is that we all know how we learn best, and yet we use these instruments for measuring learning that don't relate to all of these characteristics. Finally, badges are very interesting. I know a lot of folks that are doing badges now. And as somebody who did martial arts for a lot of years, you went to first, there are 10 dans. I did first dan, second dan, third dan. That's third step in Aikido. It took me 20 years to get to third step in Aikido. I'm not a third dan anymore. I'm not a second dan. I'm probably not a first dan. So I think it's important to remember that when you do badges, the fact that you acquired a badge with a certain skill has a temporal element to it. It doesn't mean that it's something that you can always do. It comes and goes. So finally, it's kind of too bad that what we're really doing, maybe some people agree, maybe don't, about standardized testing. As one famous comedian said in the United States, I got my first sense of inadequacy, where most Americans do, from standardized tests. So here we are having a conversation that I think is really a critical conversation in education today, and I am particularly appreciating being here, that it is not just a national conversation, it has become an international conversation.
Both done it in. I'm going to hand it back to Rose too, because I know you probably have a few things you'd like to pick up on from the other panellists. So.
It's always the case, isn't it, that when you say something that's quite complex in a hurry, you leave out some pieces that help to make sense of it in trying to get to the essence of what you want to say. But two things that struck me particularly from those last two things. If I start with what Larry said, I think one of the things that we've missed in our opportunity to weave the front and the back half of our curriculum together is to be really, really clear about our sense of purpose for the learning. I think, and that's one of the things that we've missed with the key competencies, because, you know, they were put there to make our curriculum so-called, and this is a cliche really now, a 21st century curriculum, but they don't do that by being added on top of the traditional learning. They've got to change the learning in some way. And the way that they change the learning, I think, is by reframing the purpose for the learning. And so what we found, when we found schools and instances of learning where people have offered really rich learning experiences, where we could see that young people's key competencies were being developed, one thing that really struck us about 5 years ago was the teachers who designed those really rich learning experiences had dual purposes. They had a purpose for now, which was more like the traditional purpose, but they also could tell you quite clearly how this piece of learning made a bigger contribution to students' longer-term futures. This little piece contributing to a much bigger agenda. And the thing that I forgot to say about capabilities, I know that when the curriculum was written and the key competencies were defined as capabilities for living and lifelong learning, probably the intention was that that was a synonym. But I don't know how many of you are aware that there is, outside of education, in developmental economics actually, this thing called the capabilities approach. And it was developed by some economists, Amartya Sen, who's Indian, and Martha Nussbaum, who's American. And the dilemma that they were addressing when they developed it was actually an assessment dilemma, a measurement dilemma, because what they were looking at was the metrics that economists have, like the Gini coefficient. That sounds impressive, I know. I actually don't know what it is, but I know it's one of the measures that economists use in gross national product and things like that. They cover a wealth of differences in people's opportunities, which is what makes me go back and think about what you were saying, Maria. And what they do with the capabilities, the question they ask is, who is this person in front of me? What are they capable of, and are the conditions under which they are living their life making it possible for them to become the people that they're capable of being? And that, I think, is the difference between competencies, which tend to be regarded in the worst cases as personality traits of students, but certainly as things you have or get or stock up or whatever, to capabilities which are a space of possibility that ask, what is this young person capable of? How are they displaying those capabilities? What capabilities am I expecting of them? What capabilities am I opening a space of possibility for them in the learning that I'm developing? And so those little indicators that I mentioned before, they are just that, indicators, because we found when the calibre of the tasks require those things, they also require many other capabilities, and we don't need to specify them all because there's so many that we can't. That way lies madness in lists and trivialising things. If we've just got these central few things that we know really matter and bring the richness of all sorts of other things along with them, then we make our design space more manageable, and at the same time got a better guide for teaching and learning action in the classroom, which is such a busy space, you can't keep too many of these things in your head anyway. And we also make the assessment space a more practical space. So it's not intended to be something that limits and curtails the curriculum. It's something that's supposed to make it possible to be expansive and emergent, but not so woolly that it's everything and nothing. Does that make sense? Yeah, that's a big idea, I know, but Maria might want to respond to that.
I wondered if Maria, you might like to respond to that the notion of the capabilities. Yeah, no
Maybe
question.
I'll position it as a wandering. Okay, what came into my head when you said that? Okay, the first thing I did was locate myself within my iwi. Second thing I did was give you a snapshot into the genealogy that I come from and why that's important defines who I am, the people whom I represent, and the blueprint that I come from. What I mean by that is that in that long line of whakapapa that comes down to me, there's a whole lot of the seeds of potential of my ancestry comes through. So your role as a kaiako is to figure out what is the potential in my whakapapa that lies in me that you are going to nourish and grow. What is it that you can see if I tell you? This book here, Pau Whakaue, talks about 8 marae that are situated in Rotorua. Of those 8 marae, each marae has tūpuna, have their own stories, their own narratives, yet I whakapapa to all of those. So if you're teaching me about leadership and the capabilities that leadership, that resides in leadership, then which ancestors are you going to draw on to make that meaningful and purposeful to me? And then how are you going to show me that globally? How are you going to show me the leadership that resides in you so I can recognise it as a student and want to emulate that? Does that make sense? I don't know. That's just my wondering. But yeah, capabilities, I suppose I call them ngā pū manawa. Ngā pū manawa e waru, that's the tribe that you're sitting in right now. 8 beating hearts of Te Aroa. But the pū manawa are like the quintessential point of being that resides in you that makes you absolutely unique from anybody else. There's no one else like you, no other teacher like you, no other principal like you. So what do you bring to that setting to mould with mine in order to grow me more? I don't know, I'm starting to rave now.
Well, I didn't really have anything else to say. I wanted to hear from people, but that notion that we're all so different is the problem that we have with measurement and assessment, is because we're the underlying assumption of it is that everyone is beginning from the same place or is going to land up at some place, and it's just a fallacy. And that's why I put up yesterday Don Campbell's law, if you were there, because Don Campbell talks about the fact that it is going to, when you measure, well, you measure things, you change them. We know that from physics, but when you measure things, and anything in physics, but when you measure people, it is very subject to corruption pressures. So how do you do it? I mean, in our schools, for example, at High Tech High, we just decided we have to take standardized tests. We're public schools. That's the way it goes. That's part of the deal, right? Our societies haven't gotten sophisticated enough to figure out a way to do it other than using a test that costs 1 cent per person, There probably are some other ways to do it, and we just decided that we were going to go on our internal metric was going to be 4-year college completion rates. And maybe that's not even correct. Maybe going to college is losing some of its significance in a lot of ways. That's a possibility too. But nonetheless, we picked a metric, and that was the metric that we wanted. We wanted kids to get into and get through 4-year colleges, and we've done pretty well with that. But I still question that. Too, because a lot of artists and a lot of musicians and a lot of people that do really, really well without going to college, and there's a lot of people that go to college, and they're in a world where so much of the employment market is shifting because of new technologies that there aren't enough jobs for people whether they went to college or not. So I don't want to sound like a downer here, but we're really facing internationally some really significant questions about this. And that's why I think this is a really important topic, because measuring human beings is probably not going to be the solution, in my opinion.
Yeah. So I always feel like I'm just audience member here because I've just been totally riveted listening to you all. And one of the things that I wanted to pick up on, or perhaps even ask the other panelists, was this idea of, you know, the school or the educational organization as a design space. I know that in the work that we do, it can be really difficult to find the time and the processes to actually go through any sort of design process. And Maria, you mentioned this idea of a co-designed student profile, and Rose, you mentioned this, the school as a design space. And I feel like over the last few years, we've seen design thinking go through a rise in the work that we do, and it feels often like it's just like an add-on. It gets added to the shoulders of people, who, you know, subject matter experts, teachers, who already have, you know, a world of responsibilities. And it feels to me like there should be more of a design team effort, but difficult to design that into the existing processes. And I'm wondering whether you've seen good examples of that, or whether you've got ideas about how that could be constructed.
If I address that question, thank you, because that's a great question on behalf of the school curriculum. And of course, hindsight is a wonderful thing, but it's quite clear after a decade of having the school curriculum and working with what is essentially a framework which requires every school to design its local curriculum and to do it in a co-constructive way that works with the community and the parents and so on. And then I think what's obvious now is that actually it expected far too much of people. It expected design to be a reasonably obvious and easy job. And if we look back over the trajectory of the implementation of the curriculum, then at the high level, that's fine when you're designing a vision and, you know, doing that bit, the mission statement of the school and everything. And of course, we saw some wonderful designs. People made these most amazing visual things that showed how they would bring the elements of the curriculum together. But the rubber hits the road when the actual learning experiences day to day, week to week, get designed, and that is an infinitely much more difficult job, I think, than we ever imagined or estimated. And like I said, hindsight's a wonderful thing, but clearly we needed more signposts, more exemplars, more ways to do that. And maybe actually even saying that now, I think, how could we before we really knew what the design challenge was? Because I think it's taken a while for that to become clear. And can I just say, for the secondary teachers in the room, there's a real double banger challenge here, because I don't think that we've thought enough about the NCEA as a design challenge. And when you've got a flexible curriculum framework and a potentially endlessly flexible suite of assessment resources to use, then you're putting one set of complexity and flexibility on top of another set of flexibility and complexity, and that ups the design challenge enormously, particularly as the people outside of school looking in, judging, are going to be judging with traditional spectacles, expecting to see the sorts of designs that they might have encountered when they were at school. So I think the other thing that we haven't done well enough is to communicate the need for new designs and to involve and therefore get the buy-in, if you like, of our wider communities and parents for fundamentally different ways of designing and organising learning and assessment. And of course it's easy for me to sit here and say, this is what we didn't do so well, this is what the challenges are. It's hard because it is hard. And there's still a lot of hard thinking to go yet. But I'm a Pollyanna, as those of you who know me will know. But my sense is that we are actually about to do another quite rapid upswing in our thinking about how we address some of these problems. And I think, as the Minister is wont to say and said this morning, we've got this amazing curriculum, and, you know, we might say, ho, 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 you know, of course she's going to say that, but it really is true. When you look at the constraints, the design constraints that people face around the place, we're both blessed and cursed with ours, because we do actually have much more freedom, potentially, to make really vibrant curriculum and assessment designs.
It's a double-edged sword. And I like that, the double bang challenge in secondary. I think maybe would it be okay now if we head to the floor we'll chuck the mic about. I've seen a few people sort of murmuring to one another, so I'm sure we've got some questions. Tara's going to give us a hand with this. I better not just chuck it at just anybody. But we've got one over there. You putting your hand, you ready for it? I'm going to just toss it to Tara, and then you can, but don't hit the laptops. Tara. So you just answer.
Talk about assessment of my catching skills. Really interesting discussion. Thank you for bringing all of your different perspectives. And as a teacher in the sandbox, I'm not going to say trenches, I'm going to say to play metaphors instead of war metaphors. As a teacher in the sandbox, and this is such a huge question, how come we never talk about assessment in real world as part of our model for designing? Sometimes I laugh and I think, what if we took the school model into the real world? Nothing would ever get developed. I mean, and we overlaid it to some of our new tech companies, or even, you know, our old school, you know, power companies. Why does it have to be this is school and that is real world? What lessons can we take from real world in designing? Because, like, if you don't, you know, make your deadlines, or you don't, you know, the product fails, you know, there's other systems in places. So what's that disconnect?
Well, I don't know if I have an answer. It's a really great question, though. That is the real world, right? And obviously, for corporations, there's a financial imperative. You're either making money or you're losing money. And what should we do? Good question. I mean, happiness index. That's, you know, it's kind of that's obviously, you know, go to some school regulator and say you're going to. But we have a really great happiness index. I think the state of California would not be particularly thrilled if we said that, because we get public dollars from, you know, to educate kids and to keep them safe and stuff like that. But I do think success later in life would be and how would we describe success in later in life? Like, how much do you contribute to society in a healthy way would be a very, very good index. I mean, sports measures things, right? TV shows measure things. We have a horrific presidential election that's going on, and I check those measurements about 5 times a day, mostly because I've never been so frightened in my life. But now I can finally relax, because it's 91% to 19%, to 9%, excuse me. So it's that election is pretty much decided. So we do use numbers all the time. But again, for us, we just decided it was going to be getting through college. And we had another one too, and it could be criticized, of course. And that was because of the people who created the school. It was science, technology, the importance of having people enter science, technology, engineering, and math. Not that it's bad to become an artist, not that it's bad to become a million other things. And we decided, because of our initial creators, that we were going to try to get students getting advanced degrees in that. And in fact, 17% of the undergraduates in the United States major in science, technology, engineering, or math. As I said yesterday, half of our kids come from poverty. About 90% graduate from college. 67% are of color. and 38% of our kids get degrees in science, technology, engineering, and math. I don't know if that's a good result, but I know why they're doing it. It's because they're in a school that isn't focused that much on measurement. It's focusing them on a love of science, technology, engineering, and math. If we focus too much on the measurement, we would have, ironically, lower rates because it would be boring.
I think we have to be careful that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We have to remind ourselves that some of the assessment tools that we've got can generate very good formative information that actually can help teachers make robust decisions about where they should take their teaching and learning next. The trick is knowing when we need to use something like that and when we can let go of all the noise. I think around all the other things, I was picking up on something that Larry said before. I heard Mark Prensky talking earlier this year at a conference, and he's got this idea that the older now, he's probably had it for a while, he's just written a book about it, I understand. His idea is that the ultimate measure of the success of kids' learning should be, did they make a difference in the world? Did they do something that improved the environment, the living conditions, whatever, for them, their class, their community, sometimes more than that. It's an idealistic vision, but I think that there are some practical ways that we could work towards documenting those things, portfolios, and just we've got solutions to these things. What we need is for people to accept that that is a legitimate marker of learning, because for such a long time we associated legitimate markers of learning with numbers on a page, which actually legitimate very little. We've just got to think differently about how we use the tools we've got and how we marshal the evidence that's out there.
So, Rose, just tell us a little bit more about the tools that you think are the most useful. What's on top for you at the moment?
Well, my answer to that question would be it depends. I mean, it's a case of horses for courses, isn't it? It depends why you're doing the assessment, what the purpose for the learning was, and what you want the tool to tell you. So if you're wanting to find out where your kids are in terms of making progress in their reading or their writing or their maths, then of course the tools that we've got are useful to use for that. But just rushing to make new tools where we see some holes, I don't think is something that we should be doing. We'd be creating a rod for our own backs if we do that. I know that's not quite an answer to your question, but
I was also interested in your reference to key competencies and whether there's anything that you're seeing at the moment that you feel very comfortable and excited about, I guess.
I absolutely, definitely don't believe that we should be making separate tools for these things. If we're going to do anything at all with these ideas that I was talking about before, I think the place to start with those is with self-audit of the opportunities for students, because they will be manifest in so many different tasks potentially across the curriculum and different types of learning activities and everything. And yes, once we understand the scope of what we're looking for, then we could start looking at things like putting portfolios together. But the place to start is auditing the opportunities, I think. Because if we're looking for some of these sorts of capabilities that we haven't had a history of looking for, what are we going to do to put a progression together? Are we just going to go, oh, and that probably comes next? Oh, and then it'll be that. We will miss things that we don't even know that we're going to miss. And I just absolutely, definitely don't think we should be building new tools by a rhetoric of conclusions, which is what we've seen happen with some of the matrices and rubrics that have been constructed just out of people's personal experiences. Because if there's one thing that comes out of the neuroscience research and, some of those areas that Michael was talking about this morning, I think it is that we can be absolutely certain that we don't know what our kids are capable of because we haven't required it of them yet. And if we just actually work with what we've got now, we'll go round the same old go-round and we'll be stuck there and we'll miss a huge opportunity to really enrich and deepen and take in learning forward. So we shouldn't be rushing into doing these things. We should be actually looking to see what kids are capable of. And the only way we can do that is to audit the opportunities we give them to show us it. That's where we should start, I believe.
Just going on that, Rose, I guess my place of starting to work with schools that I work in, don't think about assessment at all. As I said, think about who's in front of us, who is this iwi. Like I went to a school and, talk about graduate profiles or learner profiles or whatever, however they want to word that. So what lens do you think through when you can go to one school and they'll say, kia tū rangatira ai, to stand as a leader. And then we unpack, well, tell me what that means. And so we unpack the indicators so that we're all clear on what those are. So to stand as a rangatira, one of the indicators that comes out of all that aspirational voice is that they can stand and tell their genealogy to the ancestor. So the land that the school is on usually belongs to a particular iwi, and there's a name that was given before colonisation, say. But kia tū rangatira ai, one of the indicators could be that you can name the tribal group, the chiefly lines, and so on, to be able to say kia tū rangatira ai, whether you're this height or this height. The second, oh gosh, now I've lost it. What was the question? Okay, so the graduate profile. So that's an easy one. But then when you go to an iwi that think in mountains and they think in lakes, and so they don't think of, they think that when I look at that mountain, I see, one of our students. And in the mountain are all the qualities, capabilities maybe, all those things are represented in that mountain. So how are you going to know, how to assess that unless you ask the people what it is that's most important? So when we go in, we do that, we do all of this, and I quite often have to say to the leadership of the school, tai hoa, I don't want you involved in these in these conversations. Allow the whānau to have their voice without interruption. The purpose, the role of the professionals in the school is to deliver on the aspirations that come out. That is how I see your role. You have the professional expertise to make what they want happen. The other part to that is that you play a crucial role in also reimagining what the space can look like. Come to a conference and you're inspired by words, from the key speakers. Arohamai, I didn't know who he was. But, you're inspired by people and what they're saying. So you take that back to re-inspire the organisation that you're in. You tell the kids about these great people who you've listened to. Who are they in your area? And so I guess out of those conversations then come, in some schools we've thrown out probably half of what they used to do because they realise, actually, why are we doing that? So it doesn't actually link back to the person who we said we are trying to grow here. And then everything, they start to look at kapahaka. How many do kapahaka in your school? How many schools are sitting in, they have kapahaka groups? Okay, classic. might go into a school and I'll say, so some of the waiata that because quite often I can go into a school and there might be, kapahaka is the added on. It's actually the teachers do everything else that everybody else is doing, plus they take the kapahaka group. And I say, okay, we need to reimagine that, because the performance that you put on the stage is actually it can be a whole term's work. When you start to dive in to the depth that's actually in each of the waiata. You've got the critical thinking in there. You have you could actually, I suppose what you were saying, pull out those capabilities and those aspects. But how many have actually done that? How many have actually looked at a waiata tangi and actually taken off the layers to actually look at the imagery that lies in those songs that are lamenting the death of somebody? And so it's like, with the people, you're reimagining the things that are already there that have never actually been looked at as maybe an we don't call it assessment, we call it aromatawai. And one of the big differences in there is your heart, is that smile. A smile is an aromatawai. How do you measure the smile? When you know in your gut that you've made a difference. Anyway.
Kia ora. Joyce, did you want to pick?
Yeah, I think what I'd like to share is just an example of a program that I know that really changed, the way that they thought about assessment, and it is at a tertiary level. But I think the way that they went about it, I thought was really interesting. There is a master's degree at the Michigan State University. Which they only started, it's a bachelor's degree, and they only started it about 2 years ago. So they were enrolling students from different other degrees that Michigan State has into that bachelor's degree. They've just graduated the first 6 students. But the interesting thing about that degree is that only half of the work that the students do is formal, so they go through classes and they go through courses. Everything else is done through other types of learning experiences. So things like being a participant in an experience project, an experience design project with local not-for-profits groups, or attending a particular showcase or presenting at a showcase. And what they were doing is they were giving students points for this. So it kind of starts in their first year, and throughout the entire degree they have to collect these points, and it was all done in an Excel sheet. And then they said, well, actually students are getting different things from these learning experiences. So the fact that you attended one of these showcase events doesn't always mean that you get the same thing out of it. So they started to think about, could they design a badge system that would replace the point system, and that would actually reflect what the students got out of that experience. So rather than saying you get this if you do this, it was, you're going to experience a number of different experiences. You might, and you're going to do that over the course of 3 years, but you can decide which one is your next learning goal, what is the next thing that you're striking out for, and then focus on that. And it was very closely related to their graduate profile, so the badge system that kind of overlaid this cloud of learning experiences. And I think that's a really interesting model, and I'm hoping to follow along as they start to roll that out.
I think we'll go back to the floor for questions. Right, next.
Twitter.
Okay, go for it, Tara.
Right. So this is a question from Rosemary from Himina over Twitter. She says, how do we know what students are capable of being and doing? How much do we influence that? And then goes on to say, I was meaning more in terms of standardised testing and goals set by teachers and schools rather than students.
Can you repeat that? Because I heard the statement, but I'm not sure if I heard the question in it.
Yep. So how do we know what students are capable of being and doing? How much do we influence that? I was meaning more in terms of standardised testing and goals set by teachers and schools rather than goals set by the students.
I think that I'd change the verb in there from influence to limit. how much do we limit what our students are capable of? It's a great question, and obviously a very good starting point is involving them more in setting the targets for their learning. I think, I bet everybody out here knows that when we're looking around at discoveries that are being made in the way people are thinking about humans as learning beings, there is this sense that we have limited our expectations in the past, and that's opening up. I can see that Larry really wants to respond to this.
Well, given everything else I've said, can you hear me? Yeah, no. Okay. Given everything I've said about measurement, it might come as a surprise to you that we have 7 people who work full-time just quantifying things that we do. We got a big 5-year grant from a foundation to do that. And they decided to base their work on Atula Wande's work, who won a Nobel Prize for this, because what he did was he realized that iatrogenesis, which is disease caused by doctors, could be limited if you had a hand cleaning station at every doorway of every examination room. So every doctor who ever walked in a room, or nurse, and left, even if they were there for 10 seconds, washed their hands when they came in, washed their hands when they went out. And iatrogenesis rates dropped really dramatically. So the folks in our shop decided, why is it that Latino and African-American boys are doing the least well? Asian females are doing the best across our whole demography. So what could we do about those boys? So maybe they were stretching the Atula Wande thing too much, but they thought that maybe they really didn't know what their homework was that night. So they had an idea that was kind of like that little hand cleaning station. And we're going to make sure that even in a notebook or someplace, every boy before he left would know exactly what his assignment was. And actually it did improve a little bit. But then some of us, and I was one of the some of us, said, wait a second. What about distance from school to home for some of those boys compared to other boys? What about the fact that they're not being picked up by car, they're taking public transportation that lasts a long time? What about the fact that when they get home, nobody else is home because their parents are still working? What about the fact that there's a TV on really loud? It's just, this is the problem that those are fair questions. We're still trying. We have improved the rate of those boys, by the way, but still those other questions, they're always in there, and that is the point of. That's why I said the thing about Don Campbell's Law, which is just read Campbell's Law anytime you want to. It's just right in Wikipedia. It's a single sentence about the extent to which corruption pressures affect every single thing that you measure in social enterprises. It doesn't mean that you don't measure. I don't want to come across as thinking that it's really important to know, and it's really important to improve, because improvement science is a great benefit to. That's why we teach, is so that people can do better, go farther. So I don't want to be misunderstood about that. I'm still troubled about. I'm troubled, and I don't need to repeat myself. You know why I'm troubled. I've already expressed it about how much we distort. Schools get distorted away from being wonderful places to spend your day in if you're a child, because of chasing numbers that might not be the right numbers. That's the problem.
Should have just thrown it, Tara.
Thank you. This might seem like a silly question, but I think we do have an amazing curriculum and there's so much scope within it, and I'm loving hearing the stories that are being told from the panel. What concerns me, and I might have it wrong, is that we have all these opportunities to do wonderful, authentic things in our schools, and yet we have a factory model still of assessment. you know, at the end of the day, the end product. And that's how I view the assessment at the end of the day. So please correct me if I'm wrong, but could you speak to that?
That's a tricky question for me to engage with. To an extent, I think that that's true, and it's always the case that when you create targets, the seeds of perverse incentives come with them, which I think is what one of the things that Larry was meaning when he says as soon as you start to measure something, you shift and change it. To me, the trick is there will always be accountability, and I think one of the things that we have to realise is that this rise of accountability is not just impacting on education. It feels like it's a phenomenon that's being done to us because it's our lived experience. But in actual fact, something that I go back to reasonably often was a series of wreath lectures that the Irish philosopher Onora O'Neill did for the BBC just early in the century, about 2004, I think, when she talked about the rise of accountability in the public sector for the police, for the health professionals, for the education professionals. It's not only us that are facing these. We can't make them go away. Whatever the politicians of any stripe will have these targets and things, partly because they can, but also because I think that public spending and public systems come under ever greater scrutiny. And so the trick for us is to work with those targets and those assessments that we have to manage and try and find the way to generate the data that we need to have for them in the richest possible way so that we can use that data for other things as well and not ring fence it off just for that. I quite like the thinking of Mark Wilson from, I never know how to say this, Berkeley, got an American on the couch, University in California. He's an assessment expert who says if you make a narrow assessment for accountability purposes, that's all you can use it for. But if you make a really, really rich learning experience from which you can gather data, you can distill down from that the data that you need for accountability purposes, but still use it for the other things that you need to do as well. I know, again, that this stuff is easier said than done, but that's the best that I can say, is to weave the things together the best way you can to make the learning experiences as rich as possible for the kids and find smart ways to extract the data from that and involve the kids in that as much as you can.
I'm just thinking with the factory model of education, Māori have really benefited from that. Not. And so there's always resistance to that, or maybe puzzling away to think, okay, how can we make this work for us, or how can we totally transform it? So I was thinking, when I'm talking about gathering those voices, and I talk about iwi ones, really look at, those are the very people that can help transform the experience, because I suppose this is like a liberating pedagogy thing, I'm not sure, but it's the people, the students. But Māori students are situated within the ones that I roll with are situated within a whānau. And the whānau is a very, very important unit. So, even when you're trying to create relationships, you can't really get to the students unless you go through the whānau first in some places. And I'm really passionate about iwi positioning themselves to support schools to transform what happens in there. And factory model, that would be because you go into the profession with your heart. I don't think I've ever met a teacher who did not go in there with their heart. Somewhere along the line, you know, some of that gets trampled on and, you know, all sorts, but your heart is still there. And so for me, for iwi, I want to look at how we can help that, because we certainly want to change. You know, I always hear deficit and all that sort of thing, you know. We want to change that because we know that we can do it. So here, I'm part of on an educational arm of Ngāti Whakaue, and we have, we do things like Mata Kōkiri. It's a science wānanga that we hold for whānau and the students, our kids, and they go to these wānanga, and the wānanga are based around part of our tribal things, like, say, agriculture is a huge thing for our tribe. So the science that they learn is they learn about some of our gardeners, they learn about our history, and at the same time they're also learning about how to sustain the land for future food gathering practices. Now within that, you know, if agriculture is important to that iwi, then surely that can have, you know, you can look at how do you transform what happens in the school to help support that. Because later on what we want to do is grow our scientists. We want to grow all of those in our tribe. And we're also looking at some of the trusts that we have are going into businesses. So one particular group here is Pukero Ruawhata, and they're looking at setting up 4 businesses. And my question is, so how do we, if one of the businesses is going to be tourism, another one is going to be hospitality, then really we should only be, this might sound selfish, we should only really be looking at growing Ngāti Whakaue students into those positions if that's the passion that they, you know, want to go in. So we really want to be deliberate and get away, you know, and be a part of the decision making about, you know, what is taught, how are you sustaining our histories, our language, and growing the passions inside our students where you teach. And I think when you go back to the people, when you go back to, you know, whānau agency, student agency, whatever, you know, iwi agency, I think that can help get away from even looking at assessment. If people believe, that's how kōhanga and all those started, because they believed, actually, this ain't working for me. So what's going to work? And you have the courage to try it. That makes, yeah.
Kia ora, Maria. There's a question over the back.
Sure. I should preface my question by simply saying that I'm a really big believer in the process of teaching, so that kids can learn really well. And if you take care of the process, then the data will simply come out as the end result. We certainly don't fixate upon the data from day to day. It just happens, you know, mid-January when results come out. I had a question, though, it's rather long-winded here. Just you mentioned, Rosemary, about auditing our opportunities. Now, obviously, NCA, at the end of the year, there's a standardised set of examinations, so it's a standardised assessment, used as entry, obviously, into tertiary study. There's sort of limited scope, really, to audit NCA as much as you suggest. Now, it's true that many schools are getting pretty creative with the proportion of internal achievement standards they offer relative to external achievement standards. You can see that in the number of student entries across papers, even within a single subject. Schools are getting pretty creative with, obviously, the context that they're employing in internal achievement standards, and also the variety of kind of assessment tools that are actually being used in internal assessments. I guess I see assessment at the end of the day, and whether it's points, badges, credits, grades, or whatever, or some subjective appraisal, assessment is being used as a discriminatory tool to allow people to pass on into various, into employment or into further study. What actually is the legitimate alternative to standardised assessment at some point? And I take your point, Larry, that your admission that your metric is somehow is shifted to 4 years worth of college, but again, that's just using standardised assessment tools at the end of the day. But what is the alternative if it's not standardised assessment?
Yeah. Great question. I'll just tell a story, but it's an insufficient answer, but it happened recently, okay? I'm thinking about those boys and homework. really interesting gentleman from rural Virginia. He's about my age. He retired from the military. He's African American. And there was a civil rights event that happened in 1951 in his town, where there were 400 white students and 400 black students, and they had a building for 400 white students where the 400 white students were, and they had a building for 100 students where the 400 black students were. And so they walked out and had a big event and made a big thing about it. And it was called the Moton building, was the building that was too small. When he retired from the military, the vice presidential debate was just held in that very small town 2 nights ago. Little odd thing. But at any rate, so he bought the building, and he's making it into a museum about that event in 1951. So I was out of town, and I got a text message from him, because he's come several times because we're helping him with his school. And he said that there was a young girl who was taking us on our tour, and as we always have student-led tours, and when they come in and people get to ask whatever. At the end during our tour, one of the people in my group said, "Do you have homework at night?" And this 10th grade girl said, "No." And someone else in our group said, "Well, what do you do when you get home?" And she said, "Work on my projects." That's a form of assessment.
I'm just thinking, Ngāti Whakaue worked alongside high school teachers, high school history teachers, to put together a NCA Level 2 unit based on an important event that happened here. And I've just drafted that first draft, so, that's a way of contextualising the learning for, which, was cool.
There were many, many layers to that question/comment that you made. It's tricky to know which bit a piece of it to pick up, but perhaps in the little bit of time we've got left, I'd just like to pick up the piece about standardisation, because underneath that word there are all sorts of layers of assumptions, and one of the reasons that we've had exams has been the presumption that if we put a group of kids into the same room under the same conditions for the same time, ask the same questions, we will get a fair demonstration of their learning. And we know that there is some cautious opening up of ways of conducting external assessment. The fallback is what we're used to, which is the exam. There are other ways to do it, but the challenge to crack is how you manage variability, because just as different kids have a different experience of that exam and they're not as fair as we like to fondly imagine that they are, so different assessors will look at the same piece of work and make different judgments of it. Kids will understand the same task somewhat differently. Some of them will do things we didn't expect them to do. It's getting smarter at having systems for managing variability within reasonable limits is the standardisation issue that I think it's fair to say that NZQA has been working on actively over the last decade and getting better systems for. And as those systems get smarter, then I think that we'll see much more opening up of the types of opportunities for standardised assessment, so that we don't have to rely on exams with all the limitations that we know that they have, which is not to say that we might not still use some time-limited assessments. If they're really well designed, you can find out some amazing things from them. It's just that they limit the range of things that you can find out, which is one of the things I think was under what you said. Yeah. Yeah, the question that was asked at its heart is the fairness question about sorting, because we do know that assessment has to do several things, and those things pull in tension to each other. So the NCEA system was designed to credential what kids learn and know, whereas the bursary exam that preceded it was designed to sort kids out. So the right kids went on to the next level of opportunities. I'm making the contrast stark and crude, but it is a fundamental difference in the purpose that the two systems were organised for. And I think we have to be very careful that we don't let the sorting purpose dominate the learning purpose, because we know that we have to keep kids learning, so we have to get smarter about the sorting purpose so that it's still fair. I can see that Larry wants to respond.
We're running out of time.
We're out of time. I just want to double down on that, because it's contrary all the time, and in agreement with that it's really both and, not either or. If you're living in a society which has standardized tests, you do the standardized tests, right? So I was in a Middle Eastern country that has standardized tests, and we're meeting with teachers, say, we can't do this stuff you're talking about because of the matriculation exams. That's what they're called. And then there was a teacher strike the next day, so we couldn't meet with teachers anymore. We were there for a week. So we spent the whole week talking to professionals who had a certain level of economic success, and asked them, how did you prepare for the matriculations when you were a K-12 student in your country? And almost everyone said, oh, for the 4 or 5 weeks before the exam, I took the exam a million times, right? Just like I did with law school. And then we talked to people that did not have advanced degrees and were doing fine, doing other things. How did you prepare? 4 or 5 weeks. And then we went back, and then the teachers' strike ended. And we got to meet with the teachers again, and we said, okay, you've got a 50-week school year. We talked to people with great success economically and limited success economically, and everyone says they prepared for the test for 4 or 5 weeks. What are you doing with the other 45 weeks?
Joyce, did you want to have the final say?
Just
You've got 10 seconds.
10 seconds, okay. Just as something that I share your concern about badges, that they can very easily be co-opted into the standardization process. And but I think one of the things about badge systems is that they are not just top-down. The idea is that when you have a badge system, you can actually co-design with the community and with the learners that you're working with, and that gives the opportunity for people at the lower levels to actually start feeding into the larger ecosystem. So whether you actually adopt the open badges or whether there is some other way of actually setting up the assessment and the assessment system that actually builds on some of those principles, that idea that you can actually, get your learners and your schools and your communities involved in the assessment, in the building of the assessment criteria, rather than only coming in from top down.
I'd like to thank you all for your questions. I can see that we probably needed a 3-hour session because we're just warming up now in terms of the discussion. But a challenge, transforming assessment and learning is a big one. It's a tough nut to crack. We wish you all the best. I'd like to thank our panellists, and if you could please join me in giving them a big paki for their... Kia ora.